The 2x4 foot N scale layout finally has a backdrop, which really makes the layout look a lot better. I originally thought about doing photo backdrops, but decided to make some easy backdrop panels like I have done in the past. I built one panel here that has a retaining wall and two that simply represent the edge of a forested area. These are easy to build at your workbench and install on your layout, so let's see how I built them. Before I could work on the backdrop panels themselves, I needed to paint the backdrop a hazy sky color. So I mixed together some bare etched glass and ethereal mood colors that I had on hand, as these sample paints were left over from when we were deciding on some paint colors for a room a couple of years ago. I mixed them in roughly equal amounts and then painted a couple coats on the backdrop. For the backdrop panels themselves, I first started with the one featuring a retaining wall. I initially measured out the retaining wall I wanted to build on a piece of chipboard and then cut that out. Next, I cut a thin strip of chipboard to glue to the top of the retaining wall, and because I also wanted some shrubs and such on top of the retaining wall, I cut another piece of chipboard that was a little bit taller than the retaining wall itself and cut a slightly wavy pattern so it would have some variation along the top edge. I then glued those two pieces together and applied a bead of tacky glue along the top edge of the retaining wall to attach that thin strip of the chipboard. And then I used an extra piece of chipboard to kind of just help push everything in place. Now finally, I used the back of a hobby knife to score some vertical lines in the retaining wall that were about 1 ruler width apart, so the wall would have the appearance of being made up of individual panels. I then added some weight and let everything dry. And while that was drying, I cut out 4 more pieces of chipboard, with one side of each panel having an undulating pattern, and these would be the other backdrop panels for the layout. I actually only needed 3 of them, but I cut out 4 to have an extra. I painted all the areas that were to be covered with ground foam a green color, although a darker color would have actually worked out better here, something closer to a very dark green, almost black color. Once the green paint was dry, I masked off the green area on the retaining wall panel and used a chalk gray paint to paint the retaining wall portion of that panel. And when the paint had dried, it was time to apply the flocking materials. I mainly used Woodland Scenics medium green fine leaf foliage and medium green coarse turf, although I used some light green as well. I started with the retaining wall section and painted on a layer of glue. Then I broke off small pieces of the fine leaf foliage and stuck those in place. Next, I covered everything with a layer of the medium green coarse foam. Finally, I secured everything in place by dribbling on rubbing alcohol as a wetting agent and then some diluted white glue. Before I worked on the other panel sections, I cut them to size to fit the areas where I planned to install them. Then I painted them with a coat of glue and sprinkled on a layer of coarse ground foam. Then I came back and layered on pieces of fine leaf foliage and proceeded to attach everything with a soaking of rubbing alcohol and diluted glue. After that first coat of glue was in place, I sprinkled on another layer of the medium green coarse ground foam and then some of the light green, kind of like I was making a yummy green foam pizza. Everything was then soaked with more alcohol and glue mix and then set aside to dry. Before installing the panels, I decided to weather the retaining wall with my pan pastel weathering powder since it would be easier to do at the workbench. I used a grimy black, a gray, and a brown and brushed them onto the wall until I had a look that I liked. Now installing the panels on the layout itself is a simple process. I just spread some wood glue on the back of the retaining wall panel, pushed it in place, and then held it in place with some clamps while the glue dried. I glued on the panel for the short side of the layout, and then glued on the corner structure, and finally the other panel for the long side of the layout. At this point, I could finish the scenery between the track and the wall panels. I painted on some glue, applied ballast, dirt, ground foam, smoothed everything out with a brush, and then glued everything down with my usual diluted glue mix. I also put a little of the coarse ground foam right up against the bottom of the wall panels to kind of help hide that joint. And now here you can see how everything looked. In a previous video, I built a removable section of scenery for this front corner of the layout, and so I covered that with some plastic wrap and then worked on the scenery around it. But after a while, I decided to just scrap the idea of that scenery section since it made it hard to see the cars on the interchange track, and most of the time when you're operating, you wouldn't want to have it in place. And while you can remove it pretty easily, every time you remove it, you are going to cause a little bit of damage to it. So I figured it was just better to remove completely. So I added a small grassy hill instead. And so to do that, I glued down a piece of foam and then spread some wood filler around the perimeter of the foam to blend it into the surrounding base area. And once that had dried, I painted everything with a brown paint, poured on some white glue while the paint was still wet, spread that around, and then covered everything with dirt and ground foam. I soaked everything with the diluted white glue and then immediately came back with the static grass applicator and coated everything with a layer of static grass. At this point, I added more glue to the other areas I wanted static grass and applied static grass to those areas as well. And so here you can see the layout with the basic scenery work completed, including the painted backdrop and all of the completed scenery wall panels. I could have probably done a little bit better with them, but I think they look pretty good overall, and it really makes a big difference to have a backdrop around the layout instead of just those bare wood sides. Anyway, I hope this gave you some ideas for your own layout, but that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.